Hi, everyone. My name is John McBurney from the Events, Programs, and Partnerships team at the Calgary Public Library. I'd like to start tonight's program off in a good way by acknowledging the land that we are gathered. With gratitude, mutual respect, and reciprocity, we acknowledge the ancestral home, culture, and oral teachings of the Treaty 7 signatories, which includes the Siksika Nation, the Piikani Nation, Pagana Nation, the Ithka Stony Nakota Nation, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Good Stony bands, and the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and to the Otse-Pemswak Métis government. Métis Nation Battle River Territory, Nose Hill Métis District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. At the Calgary Public Library, we celebrate the stories of the community and the land that we live on. We serve the community on Unchispa, Kutsitsi, Mokinstas, which describes the gathering place where the Bow and Elbow rivers meet. And we respect all people who share, celebrate, and care for the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta. And we honor the original caretakers of the land who remind us of the ongoing histories that precede us. And we recognize our shared responsibilities going forward to help bring everyone together on this journey of truth and reconciliation. On behalf of the library, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. Calgary Public Library is proud to partner with the Calgary Jewish Federation for this event, and a sincere thank you to supporters of this program, the Balaban Family Fund, the Krell family, and the donors to the Human Rights and Holocaust Education Fund at the Calgary Public Library Foundation. On January 27th, 1945, the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp was liberated. Auschwitz was the largest of the German Nazi concentration camps and execution centers, where over 1.1 million men, women, and children were killed. 80 years later, that trauma is still felt. How we deal with trauma is personal. Some of us might keep it to ourselves. Others might prefer confiding in friends or family. And some of us might prefer a more serious tone, but as we'll see tonight, a lighthearted tone can also help us get through tough conversations. Jeremy Dauber is one of the world's experts on Jewish humor. We'll be discussing some of the surprising ways we address trauma, grief, memory, and history. Sometimes being able to find moments to laugh can help us through our darkest times. And if you're looking for more ways to navigate trauma or stress, the library can help. We're here to help. We provide resources and services for our members so that everyone in our community can find the support that works for them. The Wellness Desk provides free drop-in, on-demand health, mental health, addiction support, and health information, and referral services from Calgary's Woods Homes crisis counselors at Central, Crowfoot, and Shaughnessy Library locations. And over 99% of individuals using the Wellness Desk have said it helped them find the help they needed. And over 93% of those said they had a clear next step. This service is free with your library card, and to learn more, visit calgarylibrary.ca/wellness. This event is one of many taking places here with our partners at the Calgary Jewish Federation. Together, we've been able to deepen our understandings of the Holocaust and also understand its lasting impacts. And I'm now pleased to introduce tonight's moderator, Calgary Jewish Federation CEO, Rob Nagus. After nearly 2 decades of dedicating his career to strengthening the Jewish organizations across Ontario, Rob has brought his experience and passion back to Calgary. Rob's work with the Calgary Jewish Federation ensures Calgary's Jewish life continues to thrive with vision, enthusiasm, and pride. Welcome, Rob, and thank you so much for being here.
John, thank you for the warm introduction. That's so kind. And I really appreciate that. I didn't expect a little bit of a bio on myself as well. So that it's really nice to hear. And thank you all for joining us this evening for what is sure to be a really interesting conversation, also a sophisticated and delicate conversation given the subject matter, laughter and darkness, humor in the Holocaust. Again, I am honored to serve as a moderator. I just need to echo a few of the thank yous that John just mentioned, but I think it's worth repeating. The Holocaust and Human Rights Remembrance and Education Department at Calgary Jewish Federation, first of all, is proud to partner with the Calgary Public Library. Also, a special thank you to the Balaban family and the Viewpoint Foundation Fund, the Krell family, and the donors to the Human Rights in Holocaust Education Fund at Calgary Public Library Foundation. I also want to quickly throw a shout out to CJF's Holocaust and Human Rights Remembrance and Education chairs, Dahlia Liebman and Marnie Bondar, for making tonight happen. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, a quick note that after Dr. Dauber's formal performance, there will be a short Q&A. And if you would like to submit a question, you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen button that says Q&A. So please submit your questions and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. And now on to our main event. So Jeremy Dauber is a professor of Jewish literature and American studies at Columbia University, where he has also served as director of its Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. He received his undergraduate degree summa cum laude from Harvard and his doctorate from the University of Oxford, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. His previous books include Demon's Bedroom, Yiddish Literature, and the Early Modern, also Antonio's Devils, Writers of the Jewish Enlightenment and the Birth of Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literature, The Worlds of Shalom Aleichem, and Jewish Comedy, A Serious History. The last two were finalists for the National Jewish Book Award, and his most recent books are American Comics, A History, which was featured on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, as well as a book called Mel Brooks, Disobedient Jew. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jeremy Dauber.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Rob. Thank you so much. It is really a privilege to be here. I'm so glad to be talking about this very serious subject in this way with you tonight. Thank you for having me.
So I thank you, Jeremy. I noted that you're joining us from the East Coast and that it's late for you. So I appreciate that you're making time for us here in Mountain Standard Time. Before we dive into the question of humor in the Holocaust, I think it's important that we talk about Jewish humor and persecution more generally, how this fits into how the Holocaust is unique, and the question of, is Jewish comedy in the Holocaust unique as well to other forms of Jewish comedy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this really, thank you, Rob, for starting us off in this way. I mean, I think this really is almost the essential question. Because as you alluded to in asking it, it really gets to an essential question about the Holocaust, which is this a unique event? And we can talk about whether it is and it isn't, and how it is and how it isn't. But one of the interesting things, if you're a historian of culture, of Jewish culture, and comedy as a part of Jewish culture, is also how the people involved, how people who went through the Holocaust, how the victims, how the survivors, how they reacted to it. What kind of strategies did they use? And what a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight is this question about, well, what role did Jewish humor play in the Holocaust? And therefore, whether or not it's continuous with other kinds of strategies that Jews have used to take all sorts of events in their history and turn them into comedy, right? Or use comedy to work with those historical events in some ways. Are Jews in the Holocaust feeling and treating this as a unique event? Or are they treating it as part of a long history in comedic terms, right? And in some ways, that's a really interesting and complicated in all sorts of ways thing for us to discuss. But we're going to take it as seriously as it needs to be taken. And we're also going to treat it with the dignity and respect that its victims and the people involved deal with. So in that vein, one way that we often think about Jewish comedy, and I wrote this history of Jewish comedy, as you said, when we think there are all kinds of Jewish comedy, but one of the most prominent ways of thinking about Jewish comedy is as a response to persecution. Now, you can't obviously think of any more extreme example of persecution of Jews than the Holocaust. But as I say, there are a wide variety of responses to this that indicate in some ways that many Jews thought of this when they tried to deal with it in comedic ways in these continuous kind of ways. I'll just give you one example to start off, and we can give we will talk about lots of them. But one of them is there was someone quoted who said, and they said, I'm going to take this line from the Jewish liturgy. Thou hast chosen us, thou hast chosen us from amongst all other nations. Maybe you could choose somebody else for a little bit, right? That kind of sensibility, right, feels, of course, like the kind of thing that someone might say and did say in the heart of the Nazi inferno. But it is also a line that Shalom Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer, put in the mouth of his greatest character, Tevye the dairyman, the one who becomes the basis of Fiddler on the Roof. So, in some sense, that making that witticism that is barbed and tipped with irony and anger, and that, right, that is deeply continuous with a strategy of Jewish comedy that when Shalom Aleichem put it in Tevye's mouth, he was reacting to other kinds of Jewish persecutions. I'll give you another example. There is a line that went around in the ghettos that was sort of repeated over and over again that said, we Jews in this particular situation, we are very religious. And I'll tell you why, says the person who says this. We are punched with holes. We are dotted with holes in the same way like a matzah is, right? If you've ever seen a piece of unleavened bread, you know that often it has these little holes riddled through it, right? We eat bread the same way Jews do on Passover. In other words, we're in famine, we're in starvation, we don't eat bread at all, right? That's what we don't do on Passover. We are beaten and shouted and twisted around like groggers, like the material that you do on Purim, the holiday of Purim. We are as thin as a lulav, the palm branch that is shaken on the holiday of Sukkot, and we are burnt like Hanukkah candles, right? And that is why we are so pious. But that kind of witticism shows that these Jews, this Jew who was saying this, was in some sense thinking of themselves as the literal embodiment of a long history of Jewishness. They're not thinking of themselves as unique, perhaps in degree, but not in kind. And that becomes one of these interesting ways of saying, well, the way in which Jews reacted to this horrible thing that happened to them was as Jews, and was looking at it within the realm of Jewish history, within and using these humorous things in a way of saying, we're going to do this in the way that we have for centuries of kinds of persecution. And in some ways, that was a way in which it helped that perhaps to have a little bit of comfort, perhaps a little even resilience sometimes, perhaps a little resistance. Those are all things we're going to get to in our conversation. But this is a starting point. And as you say, Rob, the essential question of what does it mean to think about the Holocaust as a unique or not unique event, and to do the victims and the martyrs the respect that they have. We're trying to think about it in some ways in their categories as much as ours from looking out on.
So on that note, are there ways of thinking about how people who lived through the Holocaust used humor during that period? Like, are there different kinds of Holocaust comedy? And how does that help us understand the variety of events that took place during the Shoah?
Yeah, I think that that's a great way for us to proceed next, is to think in some ways. One of the things that scholars like to do, right, is we like to taxonomize. We like to make categories, right? And obviously humor is not really about neat categories. It has boundary, it breaks boundaries, it sort of blurs them for comic effect and just for aesthetic and artistic effect. But we're going to do it anyway because that's what we do. And so one way that we can think about humor that Jews used under this sort of horrible regime is a way that of resistance. And that is something that when we see all kinds of peoples under all kinds of authoritarian regimes, of all kinds of dictatorial regimes, kinds of horrible regimes, right, that they are dictators, authoritarians, are famously humorless. Right. And Hitler was no exception to this. Hitler established a series of the Nazis established a series of joke courts, they called them. They were no joke, but they were joke courts that tried people who tried to sort of make fun of the regime and do that. Right. And so telling jokes was a way of indicating, you have a kind of you're pushing back in a way that you can when you are in some sense powerless, but you do have the power or sometimes powerless, but to get under your skin. Now, I'm bracketing other kinds of armed resistance that Jews certainly did, and all kinds of other things. But this kind of resistance I'm talking about. So just to take one example of this, I mean, there are all sorts of jokes that came out, sort of trying to put it to Hitler or something, right? One of my favorites, although there are many, is the one about the Jew who is walking by a lake. And he sees somebody drowning in the lake, and he of course runs over and he pulls the person out of the lake, saving them from drowning. And it turns out that the person who he has saved is Adolf Hitler. And Hitler says, "This is thank you. You've saved my life. You've saved the life of the Fuhrer. Please, I'll grant you any request, anything at all." And he says, "I just have one request." And he says, "Anything. What is it?" He says, "Please don't tell anybody." Right. And that's this kind of, that's one kind of resistance, right? Another kind of still within this resistance taxonomy, right, is one that from the early days of the Nazi invasion to Poland, when they were still just in Germany, where they're just confiscating things rather than sending people to their deaths right away, right? And this officer comes in and he's taking sort of this property, but he says, and the person who was a woman is begging. She's begging, "Please don't take my things." And he says, "Look, I'll make you a deal. One of my eyes is glass. One of them is not. One of them is glass. And if you can correctly identify which of these eyes is the glass eye, I will not take your things." And the woman, without missing a beat, says, "It's the left eye. The left eye is the glass eye." And then the Nazi says, "That's exactly right. How could you possibly have known?" She says, "That's the one that looks human." And again, you have this sense of, is this resistance in the militaristic sense? No. But telling these jokes, sending them around, spreading them is a way of pushing back and saying, we're not going to simply take this. We're going to let people know how we feel about it. And that's going to cause a kind of solidarity. So that's one aspect maybe of this taxonomy. Another is what I might call kind of the lens of reflection. Which is to say that this is a way of saying one of the things that humor is very good at is taking a situation and allowing you to have a certain kind of superiority over it by kind of putting it through your own comic sensibility. So this is not about pushing back. In some ways, you could imagine that enough of those jokes of the first kind get around. Maybe they affect some kind of change. Certainly get under people's skin, right? These are really more about how you deal with what's going on. One of my favorite, there are, again, many in this category, many jokes in this category. I'm going to focus mostly here on jokes because they're easiest to tell in the kind of context that we have now, right? But one of them, a very famous one, probably a number of people in the audience have heard this one, right? But is a Nazi comes to a Jew and he hits him and he says, "Jew, whose fault is it that Germany has gone so terrible that it has to avenge itself, that it has to sort of go to this?" And the Jew, who's not an idiot, right, says, "Well, it's the Jews' fault, of course." And then he adds, "And the bicycle riders." And the guy says, "Well, why the bicycle riders?" And he says, "Well, why the Jews?" Right. And that sort of blurs these categories. It's a resistance one, but it's also a reflection of kind of the no-win situation that the Jews find themselves in. Right. It's a similar joke to the one that is frequently told about the Jew. One Jew walks down the street in occupied Germany, or Nazi Germany, I should say, and he finds a friend of his, a fellow Jew, reading the Der Stürmer, which was the viciously anti-Semitic Nazi newspaper. And the first Jew says to the second, "Well, why are you reading this? Why don't you read a Jewish newspaper?" And he says, "Look, I read the Jewish newspapers. The Jewish newspapers say we're being beaten, our material, our shops are being broken in it, right? We're being, we're being killed, all these things, right? I read their Sturmer. It says the Jews are in charge of the world. The Jews have all the power. Who wouldn't rather be those Jews, right?" That aspect of it is saturated with this kind of reflection, as I say, on the ironic situation that's going on right now. So that, I think, is another kind of comedy that, again, people in these kind of situations are thinking about. Then that as the final solution gets underway, of course, this becomes even more hypercharged into things that are just tragic. There was a famous exchange, a famous joking exchange in the ghetto about where one, based on sort of the stories that were going around, once people understood they were being shipped to the camps for extermination camps, where one said to another one, cheer up, we'll meet each other again because, and I apologize for this is very hard hitting. Cheer up, we'll meet again. We'll meet again in one of the shop windows in Berlin because we'll both be turned into soap. Right. And, again, I mean, I can almost hear the gasps, right, in the response here. But this was a joke that we know was told at the time by people, and it was obviously, the darkest and bleakest sort of gallows humor, but a way of trying to sort of deal with some of the possibilities of imminent extermination that were going on and that they were facing. That said, and this is the third kind of taxonomy that I would talk about, there was a famous phrase, and a famous couplet, and I will recite it first in Yiddish, which was the language that it was told in, and then I'll translate it for people who don't speak Yiddish.
Like myself, who don't speak
Is
Yiddish.
that right? It's not too late. It's not too late, right? But we say it's Lomir sein freilich und sagen und witzen, mir wollen noch Hitler und Shiva noch sitzen. And what that means is let us be happy, let us be merry, and let us sit and tell jokes because we will live to sit Shiva for Hitler, right? We will outlive Hitler, right? And we'll sit in mourning, quote unquote mourning, after his death, right? That reminds me, of course, of the famous joke that Hitler goes to a fortune teller, right? This is more of a resistance type joke, a little bit, and says, I want to know I want to know something about my fate. And the fortune teller says, well, I can tell you, I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you that you will die on a Jewish holiday. And Hitler says, really, are you sure? And she says, oh, yes, any day you die will be a Jewish holiday. Right. Again, a famous joke, right? But one which again is also suggesting at its core that the Jews will outlive this, and that gets back, Rob, to that question we were talking about earlier, right? Of what is their continuity or discontinuity here? And one of the great continuities of Jewish response to persecution is we have had a long history of persecution, and we have outlived all of it. And in fact, our greatest story of Jewish comedy, the one which is the ur text of a holiday, our sort of festive holiday, the Jewish carnival, Purim, is about outliving a genocidal maniac, right? Someone who really wants to destroy all of the Jews. He fails, and the Jews celebrate ever after, right? And so it was not surprising that Jews frequently also used the Purim story, the story that is recited in the book of Esther, and put Hitler as the latest incarnation of this Haman, and then we're able to sort of apply kind of the similar joking nature of the Megillah, right? Of course, between especially 1939 and 1945, and especially 1943 and 1945, this was not obviously a foregone conclusion, but these jokes allowed for this kind of faith, for this kind of possibility of saying, we are going to outlive this, we are going to be resilient. And the last example that I will give, or the last for this, and then we can of course talk more, but is the line. It's not a joke, but the line that was said by a Polish Jewish woman, I don't know her name, who was hung at Majdanek, and as she was brought to the gallows for resistance, and she was brought to the gallows, and she said to the Nazis who were hanging her, she said, "Today you laugh at us, but tomorrow you will be laughed at." And I think about that as that in some sense, for this woman who was about to lose her life, right, the most powerful and wounding thing that she could think of was to say that the Nazis will become an object of ridicule, right, of laughter at them. And that's something that we can talk about more as we go on. But I think that's something useful also to think about.
No, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to hear it, and you sort of try and think about the emotions and the experience that would drive this type of humor, whether it's resistance and it's anger, or you mentioned that joke that was a little bit more difficult it was a little more challenging about being in the shop window, out of utter despair. But then there are also jokes that fill us with hope for the future as well. So just interesting to see the role of humor. Can you give us some examples of Jewish humor that was created during the Holocaust? And what can we learn from them, if anything, about either Jewish history or comedy more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to give you that. That's a really good question, and I think maybe it's useful to for me to tell two, I think, almost paired jokes that span sort of exactly kind of the length of the Holocaust, and you'll see they're linked in a certain kind of way. It could be almost the same individual who's the subject of these two jokes, and I think that'll be useful in sort of helping us move forward a little bit. So in the first one, which is set and was told presumably in the very late 1930s. You have someone who is trying to flee Europe, right? They're trying to flee Europe. The Nazis are on the march. They're trying to get out, and they go to a refugee aid, and they say, well, you know, you could try America, but America has closed its gates to immigrants. They're not taking Jews anymore. And you could try Britain, but you're an adult, and the only one they're taking some children in this thing they call the kinder transport. But that's it. And you could try this place and that place, and but that place requires X now amount of money, which you don't have. All of these, and finally the man sort of look, and they're looking at the map, and they're looking at the map, and they're pointing to all these places, and finally the Jewish man sort of shakes his head and says, "Are you sure you don't have another map?" Right. And that sense, again, that's that lens of reflection, but also that sense of that anger that kind of comes at the world, right? Of saying, you have turned your back on us entirely. There's a similar joke. This is not the pair joke, but a similar one that said, the one way that the Nazis can make sure, this was in the middle of the war, the one way that the Nazis can make sure that any of their transports of materiel weren't bombed was they should write in big letters on the top, this convoy is full of Jews going to the concentration camps, because then you knew the Allies wouldn't bomb it. Right. And again, all of us who know this history of sort of the very, very little of like, why did Franklin Delano Roosevelt not bomb the tracks to Auschwitz and things like that? Right. All of that, like this was stuff that was being sort of reflected in real time. So, you have these jokes that are also very tied to the particular moments that are going place in the war. Right. You have these cabarets that are in the ghettos. You have these jokes that are being told in the latrines at Auschwitz, the camps, and some of them are very much of a very specific, particular set of moments. Right? And then this is the second part of that paired joke that I want to tell. Right, it's right after the war, and it's in another camp, but it's in a displaced person camp, and there's another man, maybe it's the same man, right? But another man sort of talking to another agent who's trying to help this person get settled. And he's got a globe. This is my favorite joke because it's very bittersweet. It's very hard. It's very sad. It's not, and he's got a globe, and he says, "Where would you like to go? You can go anywhere." And the guy points, and he points to, let's say, New Zealand, sort of the antipodes. And the agent says to him, "But that's so far away." And the guy says, "From where?" There's nowhere left, right? The world that this person, right? There's nowhere to go from, right? The first joke, there's nowhere to go to, and here there's nowhere to come from. And in some sense, that paired joke basically tells the story of that lens, that comedic lens that happens. In some ways, also, I mean, there are a lot of very powerful jokes. One that I've heard sort of more recently, but I think expresses much of the way that many people in the immediate time afterwards begin to think about the Holocaust, certainly in other kinds of places, is, there's a joke that a Holocaust survivor dies, or in some versions of the joke, it's someone who is a victim of the Nazis directly, or is a victim that dies during the war, and goes up to heaven, as of course they should. And he says, the God says to him, "Well, what happened to you?" And he says, "Well, it was really about the Holocaust." And God says, "I don't know what you're talking about." He says, "Well, you had to be there." Right. And this question of where was God when, according to Jewish theology, 6 million of his chosen people were murdered. What kind of God is this? Right? The idea that God is not present, is not absent, right? Excuse me, is absent, becomes a more and more powerful theological move. And of course, in some ways, that, like so much else in Jewish history and thought, is also reflected through comedy. Obviously, many of the jokes that we're talking about are sharp and barbed and hurtful and angry, right? But how could humor about the Holocaust be anything less? So that's already, I mean, we can talk about other examples too, but those already are some examples of both the narrowly defined historical and then reaching out to kind of the broadest possible theological canvas on which it's put. And it's all through the same method of the joke.
So it's fascinating. I think it leads me to my next question quite well, and something that I wrestled with when I was trying to, when we were preparing for this, and when I was trying to, wrap my head around the fact that we're doing a public lecture on humor in the Holocaust. So what are the moral consequences of humor both in the Holocaust, and then also what are the moral consequences in humor about the Holocaust?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I think that's an important distinction, sort of in and about. And I think, one of the things that in both in my book about Jewish comedy and in sort of my lectures, and is that it is not my place either as a historian or as a person to sit in judgment of anybody who went through this and their choices, right? I mean, about comedy, I'm talking about their choices in general, but certainly their choices about comedy. If any joke they told that maybe from our perspective we might find strange or odd or incongruous or inappropriate, right? If it helped give them a scrap of anything to help make one moment of their experience better, who are we? And I'm not, of course, Rob, we're not saying that you are, but who would we possibly be to judge that, right? So we look at some of this, and and sometimes we find that some of the things that went on surprising. We find, really, you're telling jokes in this, but that is something that human beings do. And it's something that becomes sort of a way in which our moral capacity for understanding humanity can also expand, because we say, what is it? It tells us a lot about humanity that they are not only need to, but are capable of finding humor, of being comic, of doing something, right, in, the abyss, right? And that becomes something, I think, which can be very interesting and important for us as well. So that's one of other of these moral questions. I think, like we were alluding to, as you said, it's a nice transition, right? But are these theological questions, right? And saying, comedy is a great vehicle for puncturing certain kinds of platitudes, theological or otherwise. And so, if someone said, well, it was God's will, the comedian is able to say, whatever, really? Tell that to, whatever, right? I don't think so, right? That kind of barbed joke can puncture and lead not necessarily to a lack of belief, but to a more examined and contemplative belief in the face of this kind of experience that takes these experiences seriously. So that's one set of questions. I think there are other questions too. Some of them that come up, these moral questions, can be political questions, right? Which is, what is it that we can learn, right, from the way in which some of this worked? And here I think we can get also to people like Ernest Lubitsch, the filmmaker, the refugee filmmaker, who made a movie during the war about called To Be or Not to Be. And even at the time, he got some heat. Now, he was not in the camps, he was not in the ghettos, right? He was in America when he makes this movie, but he gets some heat for sort of making jokes in this comedy about kind of Nazis, right? And he says, basically, my argument is that ridicule is having an effect, right? There's the same thing that we saw even with this woman who tragically was hung, right? This ridicule has an effect. And people who watch this and watch us making fun of people say, well, we can do this too. The emperor has no clothes, right? This is an effective weapon. It may not be as effective as guns and bombs against, but it is the effective weapon that comedians have. To Be or Not to Be, the movie that comes out in the mid-40s, or 43, starring Jack Benny, is the only remake that Mel Brooks ever does. And Mel Brooks, of course, we were talking a little bit about this before everyone else got on. But Mel Brooks, when one thinks about the question of comedy and Nazis, one thinks first, I think, of Mel Brooks and of the producers. And I use that formulation sort of very consciously because of comedy and Nazis, because what Brooks and Lubitsch, I think, are very clear about is that they are not interested in making humor about the Holocaust, that is the systematic genocide and extermination of the Jewish people. That Brooks has very famously said, I'm, into the concentration camps. I do not go. I don't think about those things. I don't talk about those things. My job is to bully the bullies. And the way that I do that is by making them ridiculous. When I say Hitler was a terrific dancer, you should know, and he was a painter and he could house paint, right? What I'm doing is cutting this guy down to size, right? And there is something about saying that the emperor has no clothes that gets under the skin that has a certain kind of effect. And that is and that in some sense, learning from that kind of comedy, which as we've said in the conversation, was also of the people who were under the Nazi boot. That is sort of a valuable lesson, perhaps, to learn. The fact, though, I think it's fair to say that Lubitsch and Brooks were both attacked very frequently for doing this gets to, I think, an interesting kind of moral question of aesthetics, which we all ask now all the time. We're much more sensitive to these questions in the 21st century than before, although Brooks particularly, I think, serves as a kind of early bellwether of this, of who can tell what kind of joke, right? And when I talk about Mel Brooks, as you were saying, I wrote this book about it. What I'm saying is it's interesting. Brooks, of course, as many of the people in the audience know, Brooks was someone who actually fought Nazis, right? When people he was a combat guy during World War II, right? I mean, so he had his personal experiences. His brother, one of his brothers, was a prisoner of war during that, right? He was someone who, but do we, what kind of license do we have to tell these kinds of jokes? And I think that in some ways, and here I'm going to bring in another name into the conversation, the comedian and television star Larry David, for the co-creator of Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm. Many comedians say, and as a historian of comedy, I'm basically in agreement with them, that there is very few subjects that are inappropriate for comedy by their very essence. The question is that there's a relative degree of difficulty in how you can do this. And to me, David has both succeeded and failed in making comedy about the Holocaust that works. And I'll give examples of both. In his show Curb Your Enthusiasm, some of you may have seen this episode, some of you may have seen the show. There is a famous episode that's often referred to as the Survivor episode. And in this episode, for those of you who don't know, Larry David is having a meal, right? And he arranges, there is a Holocaust survivor coming to his meal. And someone asks him, can I bring a survivor as well? And he sort of thinks, is it appropriate? Well, why should we just bring the two of them? Maybe they want to, it's a little awkward that's what we're bringing them to. But he decides it's okay. But what it turns out, and a twist, is that the second person is not actually a survivor of the Holocaust, but is an alumnus of the television reality show Survivor. Okay, so you can see the comedy. Now, already we're on a dangerous kind of nitroglycerin kind of territory here. But what David does with this is that he basically uses it to show the utter moral bankruptcy of people trying to make equivalences for their own personal traumas and sufferings to the Holocaust, right? So if we were talking before about, is the Holocaust unique? Is it not unique? In some ways, the Survivor episode with David Survivor shows it kind of is unique, because you have this kid from the game show saying, oh, well, you had it bad. Yeah, but we had it bad too. Like, we didn't have snacks. Our flip-flops, sand got in our flip-flops. It was awful, right? And just saying, like, no, it's not really just about the greed. There is really a massive difference here. There is an unbridgeable difference. And whether you agree with that or not, whether all the people who told the jokes, as I think, would have agreed, it is, I think, a profound point that David is trying to make. He pulls it off brilliantly. It is really a successful thing. And it really goes there in a way that Brooks says he doesn't feel comfortable going there, right? Despite the fact that Brooks, as I say, fought in World War II, so, punched Nazis for real, so to speak. And David, of course, of a later generation, did not. That said, a couple of years after the Survivor episode, excuse me, David hosts Saturday Night Live. And he tells a joke in there basically about the equivalent of his kind of nebbishy, schlocky character, George Costanza on Seinfeld, kind of like trying to check out people and sort of do opening line, like dating lines, in the line waiting for the selection at a concentration camp. And it fails. It fails. And it fails because it really does not do justice to the gravity and the seriousness of the situation in the way that David himself did just a couple of years before. But one of the things that comedians do, and this is why I'm very glad I'm not a comedian, is that they really don't necessarily know where the appropriate line is until they experiment and they try it. That's part of their job as comedians. And they understand, and David understands this as well, of course, that the consequence of failing is to be criticized and castigated for it. And he was by me, among other people. And and fair enough, right? But it's not clear that you can get the first, which actually teaches us something, I think, besides being funny, without at least the possibility of having the second one. And so that all of this said, context matters, right? Context very much matters. This is tragic in many other ways, but when Mel Brooks makes the movie of The Producers in the late 1960s and 68, and when he releases the musical version of The Producers, it was pretty easy to say, or it felt easy to say, that Nazism was over, right? I think there is apparently a production of The Producers in London, which I have not seen, but if it airs in the stages of New York City now, that is a much more debatable and complicated proposition to make. I wish it weren't. God, I wish it weren't, but it is. And so, timing matters as well. So that's, a sort of long answer to this moral question, right? But I do think that something, a lot of different kinds of questions of morality, theological, political, aesthetic, that really come out from, this broader category of morality in the Holocaust.
It's a fascinating topic. It's difficult to navigate, and as someone, like, without doubting myself, I'm quite a big fan of both Mel Brooks, but in particular Larry David and Curb Your Enthusiasm. And that Saturday Night Live joke was a difficult pill to swallow. Someone who happens to think he's one of my favorite comedians in the world. So we could talk about Larry David a whole other time. We'll invite you back. We'll have a Larry David, Mel
Sounds
Brooks
great.
specific evening.
Yeah.
My next question, though, is in a world increasingly where the Holocaust is receding into historical memory, that so many of the survivors and people who were personal witness to the counts, to these horrific events, are no longer with us. What is our role in thinking about these varieties and examples of the humor of the Holocaust?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think first, I think you're right. One of the things that you and the Balaban family and so many other, have done so powerfully is to say, we need to have this education, this Holocaust education. It's going to continue. It becomes even more pressing. I'm of an age, I don't know how old you are, I might be a little older than you, but where we could have, in my school, we could have people who were survivors who would come to, and we would be able to have the not just the testimony of their experience, because we can have that written down now. We can even have it in 3D, holograms or whatever. But we had the real people who we could see and we could feel. That is passing. And so how do we do this? And particularly, I think, how does humor, right, as you're saying, how does it play a role? And I think there are a couple of ways, maybe. The first is something that we've been kind of coming back to over and over again through the course of our conversation, but is the way that presenting humor is part of this context humanizes. And I think that's hugely important because, especially without these people being live presences in our lives, right? It is very easy to see them as photographs, maybe even as saints, right? As something that is not quite three-dimensional. And the monstrosity, the monumental monstrosity of the Holocaust is not that the Nazis killed 6 million Jewish saints. It's that they killed 6 million Jewish people. Right? They don't have to, they can be all sorts of, they can tell jokes, they can tell bad jokes, they can tell offended, right? But that means that each of these kind of humor, right? Each of these kind of jokes, this humor forces us to reckon with them as people who do a kind of recognizable behavior that all of us do. And that, I think, is a hugely important lesson, and sometimes perhaps one that is sort of underdone a little bit more. And I think humor can help us as a corrective in that, and sort of in ensuring that these are three-dimensional kind of individuals, and that we cherish them in all of their complexity. And I think that's one really important part of this. I mean, I think about this a lot. A friend of mine, Ruth Franklin, has just released a book on Anne Frank, and I have to confess I haven't read it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it, because Ruth, is someone who is able to take this person in this diary, in this remarkable text, and remember, among many other things, how funny Anne is. That in all of her observations, she's sweet and witty and funny, and sometimes she's a little unpleasant and spiky, and she's humorous in the way that she's spiky about these things too. And all of those things are, in some sense, make her a much more indelible figure than a kind of sweet, almost Shirley Temple-like little girl, right, who never got the chance to grow old. That's one. The other thing I think that's really important about humor, again, in helping us with this, right, is that it's a reminder of the way in which power and powerlessness are not always as clearly put together as we would like. Right. So that said, right, and this again goes back to sort of our beginning of the conversation as well, in which we talked about humor as a kind of resistance, and to think about sort of resilience and resistance in ways of, it is very easy for us when we talk about 6 million Jews who were killed, right, to call them victims, which they were, but therefore to move from there, from victims, to a certain kind of idea of them as passive in or helpless in that victimization. And I think humor is one of the best ways in showing how complicated and pushing back against that model is. I think, it may be, that there were many people who, well, it certainly was that there were many people who resisted with arms, but there were many, many, many more, almost everyone, I suspect, who in one way or another resisted through humor, whether it was sharing a joke or laughing, or even, as there's another quote that I didn't get a chance to talk about, but one saying, one person saying, when you see an SS officer raging at you, imagine him lying down drunk in the mud with his pants around his ankles, and he won't be that scary, right? Even that humor, right, is a kind of resistance and a kind of power, even in the abyss of powerlessness that so many of these individuals were in. And I suspect, and I mean, we know that this was practiced very widely. And I think that that's also a plausible sort of approach for us to think through this. So those would be, so in some ways, my answers to, or my pleas in some ways, to think about some of these people, right, as three-dimensional humans who laughed, who mocked, who were resilient, who were able to sort of struggle, against sort of the fate that was happening to them in these ways, among others. And that, I think, becomes, in some ways, I mean, I am a historian of comedy, so it's natural that this would be one of my kind of memorials. But it is, I think, a certain kind of fitting memorial to think of these individuals as laughing as well as crying.
So I appreciate the thoughtfulness in which you addressed that question. And we have a couple questions coming in through Q&A, but I do have one final question for you as part of the formal presentation. And Jeremy, it's a little more personal. So you're a scholar of Jewish humor broadly. what drove you to want to take on that particular topic? And as you were diving into it, you must have known eventually, you're going to go to some pretty dark places. What's the motivation and how do you sort of deal with that? What's your personal experience really trying to get to the essence of Jewish humor? What's that been like for you?
Well, thanks for letting me talk. Everybody likes to talk about themselves, and I'm no exception, so I'm happy to do it. I do think that, I was always like everybody's. I now have three kids who are between the ages of 12 and 7, and one of them just had their birthday. And
Happy birthday.
thank you. And you do have this incredible opportunity to see them discover what a sense of humor is, and to see how that to like have them learn that actually that things can be funny. One of them hasn't quite gotten it yet. She kind of hits me on the head and goes, "Comedy," which I'm like, that's not always comedy when you hit your father on the head. I got to tell you, but it continues, to say, okay. I remember trying to figure out as a kid I loved jokes. I loved thinking about them. I loved figuring them out. I loved trying to think about what made them work and what they said sort of more deeply. And I think in some ways, all kids do that a little bit because it's a way of figuring out a world, the world around them. And the world that I grew up in was largely, though not entirely, but largely a Jewish world. And so I heard lots and lots of Jewish jokes. Um, and, most of them were, as an American Jew of a certain age, kind of, the American Jewish humor that you would have seen kind of, the Woody Allen, some of the Mel Brooks stuff and things like that, right? But not the producers, right? And then as I got older, I began to sort of learn about some of the darker shades in the humor spectrum. And that was true, again, both parallel in humor in general, right? And also in Jewish humor. And it was around the same time that I began to learn more as a product again of Jewish schooling as well as just sort of Jewish life about the Holocaust, about the history of the Holocaust. And so it became kind of natural as I grew older that while I was interested in Jewish humor, I was also interested in Jewish humor in this particular period, especially since, so much of Jewish comedy was very frequently and not incorrectly, as we said before, kind of framed as a response to anti-Semitism. Now, one of the things that I do in my book is I say, well, that's not always the case, and there's lots of Jewish comedy that isn't about that, but there definitely is a lot that's about that. And so, in some ways, thinking about Jewish comedy of the Holocaust became, for a scholar and a critic, as I began teaching about it, almost the same challenge, ceteris paribus, as for Larry David, right? To think through this was the hardest possible version of what would think about Jewish comedy could be, and it remains so. But in some sense, it also becomes, as we've been saying, a kind of testament to what human beings and what Jews, as a specific case, are capable of doing, and the kind of hope and resilience and resistance that they can summon up even in sort of the darkest of possibilities. And so in some sense, if humor is almost always affirming in one way or another, this was a way of thinking about, as the title of our conversation is, the laughter and the darkness. And it was in some sense a very powerful kind of way of putting all that together.
So Jeremy, if you don't mind, I know it's getting late for you, but are
Oh,
you
no, please.
happy
I'm
to
happy
take
to
a couple
talk.
of questions from the audience?
Of course.
Okay, so the first one is what's your opinion of non-Jewish comedians making Holocaust jokes? Do they need to be Jewish to tell it, or does the joke just need to be fun?
It's a great question, and it's one actually that I think a lot about. We have become much more sensitized, and I think appropriately so, to these questions of who gets to do what, who should be, who should be licensed in some ways to tell something. There are a couple of things that I think are very frequently complicating about that, in the let's call it the media landscape that we now find ourselves. The first one is that in almost every case, what you see on a screen, with the possible exception of stand up, and even there it's not as obvious as it sometimes is, we sometimes think it is done by committee, right? So, when you talk about a show like Curb Your Enthusiasm, I say this is a Larry David joke, but I actually don't know who wrote that joke, right? I don't know how that developed, right? And so one of the things that that's interesting is that so much of humor is collaborative, and it comes out of writers' rooms, it comes out of all sorts of people on the set, all those kinds of things. So in a lot of ways, our kind of immaculate conception of someone thinks of something and then someone develops it is a little bit more complicated. Would we feel differently, for example, if we knew that Larry David had written, or Mel Brooks had written an entire script, and then a joke happened to be delivered by a non-Jewish actor, but it was written by Mel Brooks or Larry David? I'm not sure, right? But it's an interesting kind of hypothetical question based on the way that our culture actually works. The toughest, or the most clear-cut case, maybe I should say, of course, is if you have, let's say, a stand-up special that is written and performed by somebody, and they are clearly not Jewish, whatever that means. I think in that case, again, it depends very much on the perspective and the approach that is being adopted by that particular person. You could imagine, for example, and I'm just speaking hypothetically here, a Polish comedian telling a joke about the Holocaust in Poland, in which they present themselves as the descendant of a Polish person who sheltered a Jew, let's say. I'm not sure how that joke would land, and I don't know what the joke would be, but it just again reminds us how complicated not just the question of Jewish or comedian is, but also what Holocaust is. And there can be lots of different perspectives in that way. It seems very difficult for me, in the autobiographical format that stand-up often takes, for someone who is not Jewish to purport to be a Jewish person and tell a joke, a Holocaust joke in that way. That feels wrong to me intuitively. But that feels also very rare. I'll remind everybody here, one of my favorite episodes that not of Curb Your Enthusiasm, but of Seinfeld, is the episode of Seinfeld in which a pre-Breaking Bad Bryan Cranston plays a dentist who converts to Judaism. And Jerry suspects that he converts so that he can tell Jewish jokes. That just shows, even back then, now 35 years ago or whatever it was, how complicated and fraught this situation is. And I've decided here to answer your question by complicating it even further, by talking about the way in which we make comedy and also the way in which we think about the Holocaust. But in the most straightforward way, there are definitely some lines that I would say that just kind of seems inappropriate, no matter how funny it is. It's probably like, you write that joke, you think it's a great joke, give it to your Jewish comedian friend to tell. Maybe that's probably better.
I think that's sound advice. And just FYI, as it relates to that Seinfeld episode, it's one of my favorite lines when Larry goes to the priest and he says, "Does this offend you as a Jew?" And he says, "No, it offends me as a comedian." Great line. Another question which has to do with humor more broadly, not necessarily humor in the Holocaust, but can you point to, and I think you mentioned some contemporary ones with Mel Brooks and Larry David, but are there who would you define as some of the key and pinnacle figures in the history of Jewish comedy?
In the history of Jewish comedy more generally, you're saying, right?
More generally. Yeah, not necessarily in the American context, but it can be.
Yeah. So you will not be surprised, given that I also wrote a book about him, not just about Mel Brooks, that I think sort of the most important figure in Jewish comedy since the closing of the biblical canon is Shalom Aleichem, the Yiddish writer who wrote the Tevye series of stories. I think because for two reasons. The first is more broadly to our topic, right? The first is that he is someone who is able to say, I am going to take Jewish history, the contemporary Jewish history around me, and I'm going to sort of filter it through characters who can put this in a kind of comedic idiom, right? And so Tevye is the most famous of these, but he has other characters to say, things are happening in Jewish history now, fundamental transformations are taking place, and I am the guy who really, in some ways, can translate that to you. And in that sense, he is the precursor of political satirists for Jews for decades to come, as well as so many of the great Jewish talking comedians. I'm not going to say that Lenny Bruce is directly sort of looking at Shalom Aleichem as he does these things, but he owes, maybe through a link or two, an inestimable debt to Shalom Aleichem. The second, more close to what we're talking about, is that he is a kind of genius of how to think about anti-Semitism through comedy as well. Obviously, he died long before the Nazis came to power, but it's worth pointing out that for many Eastern European Jews, not knowing that the Holocaust would come, what we call World War I, the Great War, seemed very apocalyptic at the time. And Shalom Aleichem writes about this. He writes about all these pogroms. He has one story of his that haunts me all the time, which is called "Otherwise There's Nothing New." And the story is, as many of Shalom Aleichem stories are, it's a series of letters between an American Jew and an Eastern European Jew. And the American Jew says, well, he's writing, he says, oh, there's no big deal, nothing new. My little son, he doesn't want to speak Yiddish anymore. And my daughter, all she wants to do is she wants to go to the moving pictures and she doesn't want to go to school, whatever, but there's nothing new. And the Eastern European one says, yeah, no, it's the same here. There's nothing new. Like this person got killed in a pogrom and this person's store got, totally torn. It's all the same stuff. And it just shows that sort of juxtaposition in that exact same tone of voice. And it's, again, if we're talking about continuities, discontinuities, that Shalom Aleichem knew how to deal with that sort of better than anyone else. So he is again, sort of one of the greats for me. And I think that another one in a very sort of different way is Joan Rivers. And Joan Rivers, is perhaps the greatest Jewish joke machine kind of ever made, and is able to keep up kind of a high standard of, machine-like joke quality over decades, and constantly taking sort of these most basic DNA blocks of Jewish jokery and self-deprecating Jewish jokery, and sort of, again, polishing it to a high sheen. One of the most famous, and I don't always agree with this, but one of the most famous definitions of Jewish comedy by a disciple of Freud's, right, is that Jewish comedy is essentially masochistic. Jews love making fun of themselves. And Joan Rivers, parlayed that into a remarkably successful career over the years. So just a couple to talk, and we could talk about many more.
For sure, but that's an interesting thought of sort of a lot of Jewish humor is masochistic. Yes, I think that's where it gets into some of the uncomfortable nature around some of the jokes, particularly as it relates to Holocaust humor, for lack of a better term.
And I think that's right. I think that's right, Robin. I think that gets back to, that very first, we've covered a lot of comedic jokes ground over the hour, but that first one of, you chose me, right? You've chosen us among all other nations. Why don't you choose somebody else? Right? This idea of saying that every kind of claim of Jewish superiority in one way or another, whether it's theological based on some covenant or whether that, right, always, since at least the destruction of the Second Temple back 2,000 years ago, comes with a twist in the tail of saying, really? Can we really believe these things that we're saying about ourselves when we look at the historical record? Is that possible? Right. And it's that kind of doubled sensibility that leads to that kind of almost masochistic perspective. Like, are we really doing it, or are we telling a kind of game on ourselves? Are we running a game on ourselves? Are we tricking ourselves in a certain kind of way? And it's that kind of that leads to a kind of delicious kind of blackness at the heart of so much of the greatest Jewish comedy.
For sure. And it's interesting. I think a lot of the jokes are told in a sort of in retrospect is where we find the humor. It's difficult to see it in real time. I think about sort of what's going on right now, just broadly in the world, and the role for Jewish humor in helping us as a community navigate some of the challenges that we see currently. I'm wondering, is there contemporary Jewish humor that you find is particularly thoughtful or meaningful right now?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that I very much enjoy enjoyed sort of Alex Edelman's sort of piece. This one of I thought that was very strong, and in no small part because it also gets to a conjunction of someone who has a very strong and knowledgeable Jewish identity coming right up against a kind of world in which that Jewish identity can be so, I don't want to say hidden, although that's part of the premise of the show, that he's able to briefly disguise himself as a kind of white supremacist, for those of you who have not seen the show, right? But but that there is that kind of interchange that is possible that feels very modern to me, right? That is to say, I'm both very deeply Jewish, but other people don't necessarily know that that's the case. And I can, and that's a function of modernity in a certain kind of way, which I know seems not, a long historical period, but Jewish history, it's not that long. The other one that I very much liked, and it's very, very different from this, very almost the opposite, in fact, is for those of you who have not seen the Adam Sandler movie, you are so not invited to my bat mitzvah. Right? Andre, right? It's delightful. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about Sandler and Judd Apatow and kind of the other people is that on one level, they really, unlike Alex Edelman, it's pretty clear they don't really know that much about Jewish history. They don't know that much about Jewish culture. They're not, scholars of it, nor do they need to be. But they are simultaneously very interested in exploring a kind of Jewish sensibility that they have and including it in a kind of interesting way. And so you have, this sort of very thoughtful kind of one person performance piece, and you have a delightful and fun and interesting and very ethnographically wisely observed. And I don't mean this as an insult, superficial kind of look at Jewish life. Or a look at a kind of superficially Jewish life. And those two things juxtaposed are both on our screens, streaming at exactly the same time. And like that alongside a show that is not necessarily funny. It's not a comedy. I don't think one would describe it as this, but it has a lot of comic moments in it. Shtisel, which is a well observed kind of look at an ultra orthodox, community in Jerusalem, in Israel, and is full of humor. It's saturated actually with humor, but humor that comes from a very sort of deeply embedded Jewish ethnographic look at life. Again, not normally thought of as a comedy, but just as a juxtaposition to both of those, I think is interesting and appears on Netflix. All of these things, by the way, maybe the Adam Sandler movie a little bit differently, but it shows how the explosion of different kinds of platforms, streaming platforms, and other kinds of entertainment possibilities in the 21st century allow for material to come to our screens that we would never have been able to see a number of decades before. Even Seinfeld, as many of you know, was almost, it got the lowest pickup order in the history of series television as of 1989 because people were afraid, because Brandon Tartikoff was that of NBC, was afraid it was too Jewish. Now you can say we don't need to, we don't need to please tens of millions of people at any given time. We can have it for 500,000 people, and that's fine.
So thank you. And we're getting a few questions come in. A reminder to those of you watching online that you can still submit questions if you want to, but please get to them quickly because we have a few piling up here. A couple of them are actually, Jeremy, about Yiddish in particular. Okay. So, and it's interesting that you mentioned Shtisel. I'm a big fan of the show and it makes me laugh out loud. I think the lead guy in it is absolutely amazing. And a lot of it is like the rhythm and the timing of the language itself. There's like a musicality to Yiddish. I know that a lot of the early comedians that were there, people are mentioning about Borscht Belt comedians, and there was like a Jewish rhythm to the jokes that's sort of no longer around. So do you see that surviving in any way? Is that something that's lost?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, this scholar did a survey of television writers and asked them a very simple question. He said, how would you write a Jewish character, right? What does it mean to write a Jewish character? And the one thing that they could basically there were a number of answers, but the one that had like the most, upvotes, so to speak, although they didn't say that then, was to change the sentence order. In other words, to say, by this, you call coffee, right? Something like that, right? And of course, that kind of phraseology, by me, you shouldn't do that, right? That is a perfectly grammatically correct linguistic phrasing in Yiddish, right? In English, it feels funny and Jewish, right? But in Yiddish, it's just the way you say things. And this gets exactly, Rob, to the point I think you're making, which is that when people in Eastern Europe, if you were on the streets of Warsaw and you were, negotiating your latest business real estate deal, people weren't saying, "Oh, you are speaking so funny because you're speaking in Yiddish," right? That was just what they spoke. A third of the city spoke Yiddish, right? But in America, what ends up happening starting in the middle of the 20th century, as we have, right, immigration basically closes in the 1920s. There's a wave that comes after the Holocaust, but basically it closes. And increasingly Yiddish becomes part of this past. And it becomes this kind of vaguely kind of old-fashioned, vaguely little ridiculous, a little funny kind of thing, supercharged by two forces. The first of which you mentioned was the Borscht Belt, which allowed, right, these hotels, these Jewish hotels, sort of in upstate New York, that had all this entertainment that catered to both the older crowd who still spoke Yiddish and the younger crowd, their children who grew up with Yiddish but didn't necessarily, that wasn't their language. The language was English, and what they loved doing was playing, excuse me, to the paying older generation, right, by telling lots of jokes in English and then giving the punchlines in Yiddish. Because they would say, "We know who we're dealing with. We know who's paying the bills. We're gonna do it to the Yiddish." But it also sort of associated that Yiddish with comedy. Similarly, Mad Magazine in the 1950s, that great, right, that incredible comedic force, not just in Jewish life, although it was mostly Jews who really started it, but of course for America, the United States of America, certainly as a whole, right? It used Yiddish and Yiddish sounds as kind of, as you say, for their musicality and for their comic musicality. There's no Mad Magazine, I think, is central in doing that, right? Because most of its readers, they just would hear these, phrases or words, and they would say, "Well, we don't know what they mean, but clearly they're made to be like funny sound effects." And that ends up sort of, as you said, I think quite rightly, associating Yiddish and this way of talking as kind of silly and funny. And so therefore, that's what it became, at least for North Americans, in a kind of way, and understandably so, given the circumstances. It either became sentimental, nostalgic, or kind of vaguely silly. And my next book, I think, is it depends on when things come out, but is a history of Yiddish literature. And one of the things I'm trying to do is track that kind of story as it develops. So I'm glad you did.
That's fascinating. And Jeremy, we'll have to bring you back when you publish that one,
Oh,
and we'll get into details. I just want to remind people there is a survey that you can fill out. I believe if it's not already in the chat, it will be posted in the chat. Please let us know about the event. I believe it was just posted, so please let us know. I'm going to wrap us up with one final question and take us back to the question of humor in the Holocaust. And you touched on this a little bit earlier, Jeremy, but if we can just nail it down a little bit further. The future of Holocaust education is obviously changing.
Yeah.
The role of humor, how can we utilize it while not, minimizing the severity of the actual historical event itself?
Yeah, I think it's a great and powerful and important question. And what I would say is, so much of what we deal with in thinking about the Holocaust is fear, right? That is to say, we're afraid of not doing right by these people, that maybe that most of all, these people who met this terrible fate. We're afraid of maybe sort of what people might think of us if we talk about it in certain ways or not in certain ways, if we don't use exactly the right word, if we use the wrong word, right? We're afraid of not doing everything that we should have, missing something, right? And I think in some ways where that comes out the most is feeling like we might be dishonoring by doing something that isn't in a mode of um, hushed awe and reverie. And I think in some ways that is an understandable and a beautiful impulse. And it's one that we might think a little bit, given, of course, the topic of tonight, I hope, about complementing with acknowledging these other sides. I hope, and again, I guess the survey will let us know, but that we were able to talk about some of these less talked about aspects of the experience of people in law, the experience of thinking about it in ways that incorporated these sort of somewhat incongruous ways while still being meaningful and respectful and learning. And that's something that I think that we want to do sort of more generally about Holocaust education. It's not inappropriate, it's my belief, or embarrassing or incongruous or offensive, to bring in elements that might not have been sort of the most traditional ways of thinking about it. Because as long as they are respecting and thinking about the complexity and the magnificent humanity of all of the people and all of their different diversity and complexity who were victims of the Holocaust, then I think we are cherishing and serving as custodians of their memory. And I think in some ways that might be one of the lessons that we want to take with respect, but respect to the fullness and complicatedness and majestic diversity of the individuals who are seeking to remember and love.
Jeremy, that was beautifully articulated. That really resonated with me, and I really appreciate your perspective. Again, on behalf of the Calgary Public Library, the Balaban family, the Krell family, and Calgary Jewish Federation, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's after 10 p.m. on the East Coast, so we'll let you get back. I know you're with family right now. We'll let you get back to your family, but thank you so much to joining us. To all of our audience members, thank you for coming. As well, I'll mention just how grateful Calgary Jewish Federation is for our partnership with the library. We will continue to have lots of events relating to Holocaust education, so please stay tuned, and wish you all a Laila Tov and a pleasant evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, guys.